Welcome to East Leek Local History Society. We are a lively society situated in the far south of the county. We do our own research. We publish an annual journal called the Leek Historian, and occasionally we publish our own books. Today's talk is about our great benefactor, John Bley, and the possible links between John, who gave a lot of money to the village, and the slave trade. My name is Keith, and I did the original research for the book we wrote alongside two of our colleagues in the society. You can see here the front cover of the book, which we published in 2012. John wrote many documents which we used for writing the book, and here's his signature. So, the great benefactor of East Leek in the 18th century was connected indirectly, however indirectly, with the slave trade. So what? What should we do now? What to do? This was the question that was put before the committee, and it's obvious that this is an uncomfortable question to ask, and an uncomfortable question particularly for people who weren't perhaps aware of the importance of the slave trade and didn't have much knowledge of our history. The easiest thing for people to do is to simply do nothing. Sit back, ignore it, do nothing, or just say, yes, well, we know about that and it's all in the past, so we don't need to worry about it. Well, I think we do. We discussed this matter in the committee, although it was an awkward discussion for another reason. This was during the early part of the lockdown last year, so we could only discuss it by committee meetings held with Zoom or emails sent to and fro between the members of the committee. We couldn't really explore it in any depth at a personal level, but we did discuss it. We decided that it was necessary to write a new insert for our book about the life of John Bley, although I have to say right here and now that when we looked at the book more closely, we found that in fact we had covered the slave trade in 3 separate sections and established the fact that John Bley was part of the mercantile involvement in the slave trade that was taking place in London. The insert has not been written. I'm afraid we failed to do anything about that, partly because since this happened, nobody has asked for a copy of the book. When they do, we will write an insert, and it will be up to date. Should we perhaps write a position paper for the committee? Well, we did that more or less. It's in the minutes now of the committee, and we made statements, I made statements on paper for the committee, which resulted in the end in writing an article for our annual journal, the Leek Historian, which was given free to all our members and is available at minimum cost to members of the general public. In his lifetime, John was very generous to all the people of East Leek. When he died, he left them a lot of money in his will, for which they created this lovely tomb which stands in a prominent position right in front of the church on the main street. More recently, as the village expanded and modernised, the village showed its gratitude by naming a street after him, and a little earlier one of his very distant descendants paid for this wonderful window which sits in the church, in the chancel actually of the church. Today we will look at the possible links between John Bley's work and the slave trade itself. We shall start by looking at his life in Eastleek and London. The village then had only about 400 people. It was much smaller than it is now. It was off the main routes between Nottingham and Loughborough, and so was a bit of a backwater. However, surprisingly perhaps, several families had links with tradesmen in London. John Bley's own uncle, for instance, Edward Waite, was a felt maker in the city of London. He made felt hats. They're all the rage, my dear. You don't make a fortune making felt hats, perhaps. John himself was born in 1674, and again, surprisingly, he was actually the illegitimate son of the local curate, named William Bley. William did a runner immediately after John Bley was born, disappeared, and set himself up elsewhere. So John had to be brought up by his own mother, Elizabeth White. But John kept the name Bley. We're not sure why. It might be to avoid any suggestion of bastardy, and he kept that name throughout his life. The White family did very well by John. They brought him up, educated him to some extent in the local school, but he had to walk 3 or 4 miles away across the fields, and he then swore that if he ever came into any money, he would build a school for Eastleek itself. When John was 16 years old in 1690, he was given £100 by a member of his family to come to London and set up in business. He joined the distillers' company. He became apprenticed at first, and after a 7 years apprenticeship, he was able to become a full member of the company and set himself up in business making gin. He bought a house with a workshop, shown here in with the red dot, on Lower Thames Street in the City of London, within walking distance, 100 yards, of the building shown with the yellow dot, which was the Customs House. This house was key to all the merchandise coming in and going out of London. Ships with their cargoes coming into London had to call at the dock and have their goods checked and charged import duty, and when they left, the same in reverse. So John was in an ideal position to take part in the regular trade in what was becoming the merchant capital of the world. The picture on the left shows you the kind of equipment that John used in his workshop. It looks rather simple and crude today, but it served its purpose. On the right, you've got the recipe for making gin at that time. It's a very complicated recipe with a lot of spices, cinnamon, nutmegs, maces, ginger, cloves, and so on. The gin that he made, and was made by other people in London at the time, was very different from our own gin, if you know what our gin looks like and tastes like. The 17th and 18th century gin was thick and heavy. It was rather viscous and could be watered down, which was a great advantage if you're very poor and you don't have much money and you need a painkiller, a cheap painkiller. Hence the gin explosion in the 18th century. John spent the rest of his life living and working in London, but he came home occasionally to see his mother and her family. In 1718 he had enough money to be able to build her and her family a large, splendid house which still sits on the main street of Eastleigh. This is a typical Georgian double-pile house. A little later on, he had enough money again to fulfil his promise that when he was a child, that he would build a school for the village. And this he did in 1723. It's now called the John Bley Free School, but it was given various names at the time, the John Bley Academy and so on. It was a bit unusual in that, as well as teaching boys, it also took in girls, both for free, and that was unusual at the time. Finally, very unusually, there is no mention in any of John Bley's writings, in any of the literature about the school, no mention of religious teaching, no teaching of the catechism, for instance, no going to church, as far as we know. The school was very successful because it was very well endowed. John bought land in a neighbouring village, which paid for the teacher's salary and for the upkeep of the school. Though inevitably inflation bit in, and by 1874, as you can see here from this picture, this school was a bit dilapidated. You can see signs of broken windows and so on. Following the 1870 Education Act, the village set up its own board school. John Bley's school was knocked down, and the board school was replaced it on the same site. The board school, which you can see on the right, eventually became the council school after 1902, and then nowadays the Brookside Primary School. John died in 1731. He left an extensive will, very detailed, because he had so many bequests to make. His estate altogether was valued at the time at about £20,000 to £30,000, though we now think this might have been a bit of an exaggeration. Certainly he was a multi-millionaire in today's terms. There was £10,000 in cash held in the Bank of England and another private bank, plus 6 houses in the City of London. We don't know what those were worth exactly, but they would certainly be worth a lot of money today. He also had shares in 2 companies and part shares in 3 ships. Most of the money came back to Eastleigh. This was a massive injection of cash at a very good time for the village because it was on the eve of the Industrial Revolution and part of the Georgian wealth accumulation. £5,000 went to the White family directly, £1,000 to one of his relatives by marriage, £1,600 to the Hopkins family, another relative by marriage, money to other friends of servants, including a servant in London, and £1,000 to John Turner. Now, we don't know who John Turner was. He was a 4-year-old child, but we don't know what his relationship to John Bley was. That's a mystery to be solved sometime later. Then, to show his generosity to the village, he gave £10 to each farming family in the village. This was quite extraordinary, and the village must have been very pleased to have received the terms of the will. He also gave £10 to be distributed amongst Eastleigh's poor people. What an injection that must have been. And £10 also to the poor people in all the neighbouring parishes. So this benefactor is well worth commemorating. Today we recognise John Bley as a great benefactor to the village. We published this book in 2012, and a little later we decided to install 2 blue plaques, one on his house at the top there, John Bley, dates, distiller and benefactor of London and Eastleigh, built this house in 1718, and at the bottom The John Bley Free School stood on this site for 150 years, and there's a picture there of the head teacher and some of his infant pupils, together with the plaque on the school wall. So he was commemorated in his time, and he's commemorated today. But that leaves open the question, where did the money come from? And with the money comes another question. What has all this got to do with the slave trade? I hope you will excuse a little diversion here while I explain where I'm coming from and a bit of my own personal history. I had a degree in London, and during this degree, the great leader, thinker at the time was thought to be Herbert Butterfield, who in 1931 published the Whig interpretation of history, in which he demonstrated the need for rewriting history continuously in order to remove the bias inevitably in all historians' work. Much later on, I read a remarkable book by Jared Diamond. Jared was an American philosopher who was asked a key question, a really important question, by a politician from New Guinea. Yali, this man he met, asked, why is it that all you white people developed so much cargo, so much wealth, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Good question, asking the right person. So Jared set out to explain the disparity between the wealth of European white people, European and American white people basically, and the rest of the world. The book was called Guns, Germs and Steel, and he showed, I think quite clearly, that the wealth came from accidental aspects of geography and history. He was really setting up an argument against the prevailing notion that it was a matter of the talent of the white people, their innate intelligence, and the differences in culture between white and black people, which is the basis of racism, of course. So Jared Diamond successfully undermined the whole of the white perception that black people were inferior. Further on, we have the scientists working on aspects of the DNA, which is part of all our physiology. Adam Rutherford summarised rather nicely a whole set of scientific arguments and evidence in his book A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, The Stories in Our Genes. The general conclusion was, of course, that we are all one race. In fact, the implications of this are that racism is not a scientific concept, it's not a scientific fact. Racism is based on a social construct. The idea of there being different races is itself a social construct with heavy political implications, obviously. Later on, I read a remarkable book by David Olusoga. Having been to one of his lectures, I bought the book and he talked about Black and British, A Forgotten History. This is the story of black people in British history. They've always been there, but we've ignored them or forgotten them or not taken a black perspective on, for instance, the Empire and the Industrial Revolution, and certainly not slavery. It's time, perhaps, we began to think again. starting with the slave trade. So I conclude from all this that Black British history is not a political event, not stirred up by radicals. It's actually the latest in a long tradition of liberal revisionism in history. The Black History movement is quite a legitimate movement. David Olusoga himself is a professor of history from Liverpool University. He has incidentally an OBE, which is, I think, is a bit of an irony. He has the Order of the British Empire. So we turn to John's involvement with the slave trade, reminding you that he had £10,000 in cash, 6 houses in central London, shares in 2 companies and 3 ships. And my wife and I started to ask the really important question: where did this money come from, really? So, searching for the links with the slave trade, we decided to follow the money. This took us to the Bank of England, where we were given permission to look in the archives. Now that was a really good experience, very interesting. You have to show your passport, for instance. In the archives are the ledger books of people in the 18th century who banked in the bank itself, left money there, took it out. This is one of many ledgers used by John Bley. We were there for a day, but it took us a long while to get to John Bley's accounts because of the rather strange alphabetical system of indexing in the ledgers. The ledgers are huge, very heavy. One person cannot carry them. But we took a camera with us, and here we have a picture of John Bley in 1730. This is the money he was taking out of the bank in 1730. This is the debit side, £4,600 in 1730, of which quite a little bit, £600, went to his uncle Edward Waite, possibly as a payback for the £100 he was given when he first came to London. So that's where the money was. Let's look at now at where it came from. We can look at John Bley's involvement in the slave trade in 2 ways. We can look at his direct involvement through slaves, slave ships, slave plantations, and his indirect involvement in investments and profiting, and possibly his awareness of slavery. Direct involvement in owning slave ships. Well, we know he never owned slaves. He certainly never owned any land in the Caribbean, no plantations. But did he actually own slave ships? What were those 3 ships that he had shares in? We discovered that it was actually trade in the Baltic. The ships were built and serviced by the Killett brothers of Yarmouth, what is now Great Yarmouth, a port on the east coast. Ideally positioned really for trade with the Baltic. There were 3 ships, the 3 brothers, the Godfrey and the Samuel and Rebecca, and you can see that these were rather smaller than the transatlantic ships required for the slave trade. For instance, the ship on the right, which is owned by the Honourable South Sea Company, has 2 rows of guns for protection. The 3 ships of the Killett brothers took part in the Baltic trade, we know. Samuel and Rebecca went to Norway many times, at most 5 times a year. These were fairly short voyages, trading in the Baltic, in Norway, the North German coast, to Russia, Denmark, Holland, and so on. 3 brothers, the same. Again, a repeat of journeys. One journey to the Mediterranean, one to Archangel, but basically the Norwegian trade in timber. But the Godfrey made rather longer voyages. 3 times it crossed the Atlantic, but not to the Caribbean. They went to New England, Greenland, and Newfoundland on the same kind of trade, perhaps more speculatively this time, looking for other outlets. So this trade had nothing to do with the slave trade. We later found that part of this journey, these journeys, involved calling in at Holland, Belgium, perhaps northern France, in order to pick up brandy. They then brought the brandy to England and took the brandy to the rest of the Baltic. So they were trading brandy for timber and other goods. We also found later that this brandy was sometimes smuggled into England, rather discreditably, and John probably wasn't aware of that, but we don't know. Brandy at the time was very valuable because it could be watered down, and you paid much less tax on brandy than wine because it was taxed by volume, and you could get a lot more alcohol out of brandy than you can wine. Still, no connection with the slave trade. So we can cancel the connection with the transatlantic trade in slavery. No direct involvement then, but what about indirect involvement? Here we go into the fact that John Bley had shares in 2 companies. One was the rather innocuous New River Company, which was set up to supply fresh water to London. Nothing to do with the slave trade. But the South Sea Company was another matter. Now, John bought annuities and bonds in the South Sea Company, not shares, so he wasn't involved in the South Sea bubble and the crash of 1720. From the article I wrote later in the Leak Historian, I said that John Bley bought bonds from the company which paid 4% interest. On his death, this was worth £3,604, or about £500,000 today. Thus, in the later part of his life, from 1715 to 1730, when he was trading in shares, in annuities and bonds, John personally benefited enormously from investing in a private company, the South Sea Company, which notoriously used the slave trade. You can see on this map you can see the connection that the South Sea Company made with the Caribbean and the ships there. The second indirect involvement with the slave trade came through the manufacture of gin. We have the recipe here for gin. At the time, lots of spices and herbs, but also right at the bottom, dulcify with white sugar. This sugar was cane sugar, and it came from the West Indies on the slave ships directly to the port of London, and John Bley, we know, was within 100 yards of being able to trade that sugar off the ships straight to his workshop. This trade was part of a much bigger picture, of course. The 3 main ports in England for the slave trade were Bristol first, then Liverpool and London, also possibly Glasgow. On the left is an extract from the government's schoolshistory.org.uk British Slave Ports website, which was set up to help children learning at home during the lockdown. Quote, Liverpool, London and Bristol each had local industry that could benefit from the goods returning on the ships. That is, slave ships. London, for example, has a large market for the sugar and food that was brought from plantations. So, John Bley was involved indirectly in slavery by buying and using the sugar that was made by slaves in the plantations in the West Indies. A third way in which John could have been involved indirectly in the slave trade was through his awareness of the presence of slaves and of the slave trade itself. This is difficult to pin down, of course, difficult to prove. The pictures here show you the kinds of company that John Bley kept in London. On the left is the trade hall and on the right a coffee house. There are, as far as I can tell, no black people in these pictures, though the coffee house is a bit suspect. It looks very realistic. We can almost hear the chat and smell the coffee. But, of course, it's what the artist wanted us, as readers, to understand that was going on in the coffee houses. These are wealthy people, shown by their wigs and their costumes, and they were merchants, just like John Bley. In fact, one of them might well be John Bley. Go back to Olusoga again, and we find, quote, the evidence suggests that black Georgians were everywhere. Now, how many? Well, it has been estimated by, for instance, Professor Jerry White of London University, in his book on London in the 18th century, that there could have been 10 to 15,000 black people living, working in London at the time. They were scattered across London, though. They were in the bars and taverns, which were meeting places for black servants. Olusoga says they are a very visible minority. What kind of jobs did they have? Well, they had the lowly jobs. They were servants employed as coachmen, as page boys, bandsmen, bargemen, stevedores on sailing ships, and so on. They were serving the dominant white merchant population. We know that John had some links indirectly with ex-slaves or slaves or black people, and he must have known a little bit about it because he had a good friend, Edward Walmsley, who had a house on Snow Hill in the city of London. Now, this house had previously been occupied by Alexander Cleave, and Cleave was at one time the representative in Gambia, Africa, representative of the slave trading Royal Africa Company. ... Say no more. I think this is clear evidence that John Bley's contacts anyway, had links with the slave trade. So he must have been aware of the presence of black people, former slaves perhaps, in London. It's interesting to note that slavery was technically illegal in Britain, in England, at the time, although the difference between slaves and ex-slaves, slaves who had freed themselves or been given their freedom, that difference, the distinction, was rather blurred over by the forces of law and order. In other words, the presence of slaves was ignored and the establishment turned a blind eye. John, as well as all his merchant friends, almost certainly read the local newspapers. This was in order to find out the conditions of trade and events across the Atlantic in the Caribbean. In 1691, this is from David Olusoga again, the London Gazette reported a 10-year-old boy named John Moore had run away with a silver collar about his neck. Also, in the same year, Thomas Papillon of London left his son an enslaved man, whom I take to be in the nature of my goods and chattels. Yes, slightly avoiding the word owned, but nevertheless you can see the relationship there. In 1703, the London Gazette advertised that a black boy, aged about 13 years, had run away from Putney with a collar about his neck, with this inscription: "The Lady of Bromfield's Black in Lincoln Fields." Ownership again. Whoever brings him to Sir Edward Bromfield's at Putney shall have a guinea reward. Yes, £1 1s, the current going rate for owning a life. In 1709, the Tatler offered a black boy, 12 years of age, fit to wait on a gentleman. He could be procured from Dennis's Coffee House in Finch Lane. Again, procurement. So if these advertisements were appearing in newspapers, it must have been part of the chat, part of the gossip amongst the merchants of London. And John Bley, therefore, must have been aware of it, aware of their presence. We can now widen our perspective and look at the position of slavery and its contribution to the general history of England at that time. This rather nice diagram comes from the BBC Bite-Size website, which again was set up to help school children during lockdown. Slavery in the middle had implications for ships and ports, for exports and manufacturing, for the Industrial Revolution, for London and finance, and for wealth and income of the wealthy people in the country. Implications meaning profit. The money that the slaves earned by growing sugarcane and other goods in the West Indies paid for shipping and ports, exports and imports, the Industrial Revolution, London finance, and the wealth of the wealthy people. This is sometimes ignored, usually completely ignored in our histories of the Georgian period, and obviously made a major contribution to the emergence of Britain as one of the wealthiest nations in the world at that time, and possibly even now. The implications for the British Empire are pretty clear. The slavery financed parts of the growth of the British Empire, financed the Industrial Revolution, aspects of it. This has been followed up in great detail by many writers, financed the Bank of England, exports, and paid for many stately homes in England. Many of the stately homes, the wealthy mansions that we visit now as visitors, and are very pleased to be able to do so. But do we ever think about the source of that money? That edition of the Leek Historian was published in autumn last year, Leek Historian number 21, and it had a 3-page discussion of the issue. The title was John Bley, the Slave Trade and East League. A personal view prompted by the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and by the books and television series by Professor David Olusoga OBE. In that article we rehearsed in general the arguments that I've used today in this talk. So the argument is summarised in the article, and the links between John Bley, slave trade and East League are explained. I quote from this article: "Re-evaluating John Bley and his part in history, we must now weigh up John Bley's personal involvement in the slave trade and the author's treatment of that involvement in the book." We did that. It was awkward because my co-authors live in the north of Yorkshire and we had to operate by email. They sent their arguments, their thoughts down. We incorporated those thoughts into this article and summarised the whole thing by saying our position today as one of the wealthiest nations on earth owes an enormous amount to the profits of slavery and to the unpaid labour, the very lives of all those black slaves. John Bley took part in that trade. Having looked at the book in detail, we decided there was no need to make any changes to the book. We would stand by every word in that book, and in fact it mentions the slave trade 3 times, so we think it's well covered in the book. And also we decided we could certainly not make any changes to the 2 blue plaques which we had installed. Again, the statements on the plaque are accurate. They don't mention the slave trade, but it's very difficult to do so in a limited space. So we left them as they are. Then we decided that we should really make an offer to the school to talk to the children of the school and to the parents, teachers and the governors. This might be a little difficult for the younger children, of course, but we have spoken to them before about John Bley, and we would do so again. Unfortunately, this was during the period of the first lockdown, and the school was in no position to offer anything to anybody. So our offer to the head teacher was politely turned down. They may come back to us later and ask us to give a talk, and we shall do so, but that's for the future. When the article was published in our Leak Historian, we had, rather surprisingly, some responses from members of our local history society. Now this was surprising because normally we get very little response at all from our readers. They just don't bother. I mean, there's no need to. But this time we had 3 interesting responses from members, and I'd like to share some of what they said here with you. First of all, a very brief statement which came by email. What a brilliant idea to write about topical issues in a historical context. Well, yes, that's possibly one of the purposes of a local history society, to examine topical issues in a historical context. You could say, people could say and have said that this is a political position. I would claim it's a legitimate historical position. The second piece was a little more thoughtful. My thoughts on your piece on John Bley. It's a very well thought out piece, if rather uncomfortable to read. I think that's interesting. That's a very honest statement. However, the facts are what they are. Well, which facts? who's in control of the facts. And it is how they are viewed at any given time that determines their effect on the reader. That's true, and teachers are very aware of that. At any other time, they would and would be just historical facts, just in inverted commas. But in the current climate, they are more emotional. Yes, indeed. Trying to put yourself into the mind of an 18th century person is not easy. News wasn't so readily available then. Well, if you are wealthy, you can read and you are interested, I think news was readily available, but perhaps not to anybody living in East Leek. And Africa was off the map as far as most people were concerned. Africa and the Caribbean. However, a businessman was interested in his profit margin. Yes, and until Wilberforce began to bring the argument into the general public, Wilberforce and many others. Sorry about the cough. The third piece takes us a bit further. Thank you for the latest edition of the Leek Historian. I find the articles very interesting, particularly the background information regarding the direct involvement of John Bley in the slave trade. Indirect involvement, I should say. I recently listened to a Melvin Bragg In Our Time podcast entitled The Gin Craze. We haven't looked at the gin craze actually here, but this member did. The gin craze, which delved into the socio-economic problems caused by gin consumption during the 18th century. A quick Google search then took me into the area of toxic philanthropy throughout the ages, whereby you can't do right for doing wrong. I think that's possibly a misapplication of the term. I don't think John Bley was a toxic philanthropist. It wasn't the giving of money to build the school that was toxic. It was the money itself. Not perhaps toxic because it didn't do any harm when it was spent on a school, but it was possibly dirty money. This response finishes by saying, while perhaps not in the Cecil Rhodes category, I can imagine in this political climate that someone may, if they haven't already, highlight the contradictions of John Bley in this respect. As was pointed out in this article, history is not absolute. Indeed, and the people who wrote the national curriculum should have been aware of that. And our views of the past are regularly changing, which certainly keeps it interesting. Indeed, and I think these three members in their statements here show that they've got the point. So now we come finally to the most awkward question of all, which is, where do we go from here? What can we do? What should we do next? As a society, it's clear that we should mention the slave trade more positively. Whenever we mention John Bley or deal with his life and his legacy, particularly when talking to schools. And perhaps we should offer a similar kind of talk, a discussion point, to our local secondary school, Key Stage 3, or possibly even Key Stage 4, depending on their own curriculum. But that's up to them whether they take up the opportunities we might offer them. Secondly, we need to reconsider perhaps our own talks, our own monthly talks. Do we need to add something to those talks? in relation to the slave trade. Perhaps we need to think about the content of those talks. Thirdly, more personally now, as we visit other places, as visitors, families, individuals, as we visit cities, towns, villages, the countryside, perhaps we need to consider asking questions, asking ourselves the questions, and perhaps asking other people the questions about the source of wealth, the sources that came to benefactors and to the owners of buildings, gardens, landscapes, perhaps run by English Heritage, perhaps by the National Trust. That's up to us as individuals, I think. Finally, the most difficult question of all. Should we invite other local history societies to consider their own local histories? I think that's a matter for them, and I don't think we have any right to ask it of other societies. We ask the question now, but perhaps no further in this case. Before finishing, I should just like to thank all those who contributed to the talk and to the book itself, particularly the 3 respondents to the Leek Historian, which I quoted from earlier. So, that's John Bley, that's the slave trade. We hope it will be the start of an ongoing debate and further discussion. Thank you very much for listening.